begin starting from next March. This project is really interested in looking at some of the, I mean, some of you might be aware of a lot of the literature, but even some of the debates upon religious identities in Punjab have foregrounded, in some ways, almost assumed some of the kind of colonial knowledge about how people identify themselves in terms of the religious categories that have been so widely critiqued in terms of the census introduction in colonial India, in terms of the point in which people begin to view themselves, are seen by the colonial state as being Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh, or Christian, to more contemporary times in which people have actually come to the institutionalized notion of religion from top down has become so embodied and interpreted in it, become part of how people begin to view themselves. And in fact, what we're trying to argue is that the popular practices, whether it be in terms of worship, whether it be in terms of the spiritual cosmology that's out there in Punjab, is one that has always continued in whatever form it has, either in resistance to the state in terms of how it perceived religious identities in Punjab, or in colluding with it in terms of social reform movements, that there's a complexity of the ways in which spirituality is actually practiced. So this project is basically trying to, not to romanticize a Punjab that is completely spiritually amorphous and fluid, but it's one that is hoping to highlight some of those fluidities in ways that aren't often highlighted. I mean, in some of the literature, say, people like Bipin Chandra, who is obviously very widely criticized as being a kind of nationalist historian, or even to the ways in which, in Pakistan, how the two-nation theory is seen to be so accepted that, yes, there is a nation, that Muslims are a nation, and Pakistan could be seen as evidence of that, or even the demand for it could be seen. But how even debates within history and political science, by falling within the traps, really, of viewing religion as being something that means something, religion equals politics, equals the way in which people are socially organized, is something that we'd like to just say, let's take a step back and go to a point in which we don't assume that there is a nation. We could say nation equals religious identity. Okay? That the nation isn't the only thing that formulates how people view their way of doing kind of spiritual practices. And so much, I think, it is within the kind of, whether you call it sociology of religion, or even in terms of studying communities, you know, the Sikh community, or the Hindu community, or even beyond that, looking in terms of castes, that we still often do fall within the trap of still using labels and assuming that they have a bigger meaning than they actually do. So I just want to just pause there for a moment and say that we're not actually arguing that these terms of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Punjab are meaningless. Of course they have meaning, they're resonant. They have very real meanings in terms of, say, how, you know, in terms of, you know, marriage practices or even reservations. So they're real, they're material outcomes of these terms as well. But alongside that we would like to look, and through the lens of gender and caste, argue that in fact there's a lot of transcending of these boundaries that carries on. I actually want to let Verinda kind of jump in here at some points too. Okay, you can follow up. So I mean, that's the kind of backdrop that I suppose both of us identified what we saw as a real gap of it's kind of moving beyond the kind of Orientalist scholarship that kind of has gone on in Punjab, which has assumed the categories. It's going beyond that. It's actually saying, and it's not using just gender and caste as a way of saying that women and men in their own ways operate within kind of religious institutions and ideologies in their own ways, and that, say, Dalits versus other caste groups operate in different ways. We find that through our own, I'll give a few kind of sort of some examples, that by using the lenses of gender and caste, and of course using them both kind of in tandem with one another as well is useful. Using the lenses of gender and caste is somehow using a position of marginality as privileging a position of marginality. So if people want to talk about the Muslim community, so using the kind of very crude two-nation theory, would often kind of view that nation as being masculine, male-oriented, upper caste, upper class sort of led. There's a kind of paternalism associated with that identity and that sense of nationhood. It kind of privileges an elite perspective, whereas the demotic or the popular carries on, okay, in terms of how, you know, lower castes might, or Dalits might view religion. Okay, I mean, in my own work years ago in Amritsar, it was something that was very striking. It wasn't sort of what I was looking for, but it was something that was so striking. I was doing research amongst Dalits around the walled city of Amritsar, was how unproblematic it was to look at a mantelpiece, say, in someone's home, going in to interview them, and for them to have Islamic iconography alongside Hindu references, alongside Sikh ones. And it wasn't, and for me at that point, I might have looked at it through the idea of the notion of syncretism, that actually, you know, some communities, and particularly Dalits, may be more comfortable, and may be more comfortable with kind of mixing different types of religious practices. But I suppose through our kind of conversations over the years, we've been looking at it in terms of, well, how and why would, say, women, for instance, be less invested in a religious category or an identity, meaning this is what it means to be Hindu, to be properly Hindu, that, you know, maybe we, you know, observe Karva Chauth, for a Sikh woman, how she might see, well, what does the institution of my religion say I should do, and similarly for Muslim women. How would it mean? How would those same questions apply to, say, a Dalit woman in terms of her investments in those religious categories? Might she feel more comfortable, say, going and worshipping at a peer's, or going actually getting a dua from a peer, or would she and simultaneously feel comfortable going to a gurdwara? You know, how and why is that kind of mixing or fluidity, how does it operate on those types of levels? So on the one hand, this is one thing we'll be pursuing, and I'll kind of talk about that in a minute in terms of the places that we've highlighted. You know, are certain religious sites, the big religious sites, the big R, are certain religious sites seen as defining of particular notions of religious belonging? So, say, Amritsar, the Golden Temple, it serves, it's kind of it's an institutional icon in many ways for Sikh identity. Similarly, Nankana Sahib, which is now in West Punjab, we kind of highlight those two, and I'll actually come back to the sites in a moment that we're kind of the ones that we're thinking of focusing upon. Is to what extent, in some ways, are those institutions seen to represent the religion? But on the other hand, to what extent, how does sites actually used in terms of popular worship? What groups are actually going, for what reasons, for what purposes? Okay, so for instance, in Nankana Sahib, in West Punjab, the birthplace of Guru Nanak, which in some ways carries a heavy burden in terms of representing some kind of Sikh identity. You know, how is it then women wearing full burqa could be seen going to the site? It's a place that's seen as being very important for women, for instance, wanting to have a male child, where women will tie a thread around the child, around, you know, front body, whatever. And that has a different type of significance, say, as other types of acts. So within these big sites, there are a lot of different types of practices that are going on that we could say are transcending, or we might say that these sites themselves are multi-purpose for lots of different purposes, for different groups, for different agendas. And it's highlighting the kind of less highlighted agendas as actually we would say a very powerful one. They may not they may not have sense of ownership of the religious institutions as such, but they are certainly, and numerically, will probably have much more, be able to say they have much more of an ownership of those sites in terms of the popular. Okay, so that's kind of highlighting some of the aspects about kind of what we're thinking, what we're interested in looking at. And of course, there's a lot of literature on kind of religious syncretic practices in Punjab. I mean, Harjot Oberoi's work, of course, is very important for us in terms of challenging the idea of these, well, actually doing that kind of historical tracing of the construction of the religious boundaries. But there's also another step to take that people like Jan Pandey as well as Oberoi have gone back to the colonial kind of moment of defining these categories as, and kind of only really going back to that moment. How do we then begin to think about religious practices which don't privilege that time? I think for us, being able to do the kind of ethnographic work at these sites, and we feel will be one sort of insight which doesn't just look at the records and look at people responding to the categories that are being imposed upon them, but looking at them through kind of either self-definition or looking at them in terms of how the popular is actually understood. Some things which may not even be seen as religious. In some ways we probably don't even use the word religion, but actually spiritual, worship, popular are used rather interchangeably for us as well in lots of terms. So for some people, say, looking may go to, you know, a gurdwara, temple or mandir to get some kind of help from some other powers that be. Others may look, say for instance in a newspaper, may call on a mobile, and there's lots of internet, and this is, you know, here advertising Maulvi Imam, Saudi Arab wallet, and this is in Gurmukhi Punjabi, obviously, targeting, you know, Sikh readership. It shows that in the popular realm there is a lot of references to, despite in fact a lot of in terms of the formal representations of particularly post kind of Khalistan movement about you know, actually going to spiritual healers and looking and even thinking about black magic, which would have been seen very kind of off limits in terms of a kind of broader kind of Sikh or even Khalsa identity. That despite that, the popular has continued on, and you can look at the media as being an important indication of that is certainly there, that people have continued to have their beliefs and to pursue them in whatever ways they can. So let me just, I mean, I've sort of set that out. I mean, in terms of what we're doing, is we've set the project up as not necessarily a comparison, but it is certainly one that crosses the border between East and West Punjab, so Indian and Pakistani Punjab. We might say Indian Pakistani occupied Punjab. I haven't thought about it like that before. But anyway, I mean, for us that border is something that is also assumed by so many academics and thinkers on Punjab. We separate the two places, and in fact religious practice and notions of spirituality have transcended that. 1947 didn't mean that these two places were completely severed from one another. Not only were those in existence pre that, but post that as well. So rather than looking at a comparison, our idea is to actually pick a number of sites of religious, meaning big sites or even small sites. And one important aspect that comes up here are the sites that were left behind, such as Nankana Sahib, that I mentioned before, and others that weren't left behind, that become very emblematic, say the Golden Temple in Amritsar, that becomes a very important sort of religious stronghold in terms of kind of recuperating a sense of identity. And then around that, what happens to these sites? How do they become either reconstructed, whether it be the SGPC, looking at how the sites are being managed in Pakistan, the ones that are left behind, or similarly the ways in which small tombs, say in one area that hopefully will be one of the sites that we end up looking at, which was a Muslim majority area not too far from Jalandhar. You know, how are those sites, which is it's very striking. I mean, the place that I've been going to since my childhood is a place that is completely littered with tombs which are well maintained. Okay? And you wonder, in a place where there would be minimal, if any, actually now there are more recent migrants, Muslim population would probably register because of recent migrants now coming from parts of West Bengal and Bihar. But post-1947, these areas, you know, were completely, there was an evacuation of the Muslim community there. So who's been maintaining these sites? They've actually been maintained by local non-Muslims. Okay. So what does that actually mean? Have people seen that in conflict? I mean, the institutional level would say, why would Sikhs, Hindus, other communities want to maintain sites that are seen as being Muslim? And for us, those sites are not necessarily Muslim. They're about the locality, the locale. That those are the sense of spirituality in these places. That fear of that locality would have been important to everyone there. There would have been a shared sense of spirituality there that would have cut across the religious boundaries there. Okay, so we don't need to go even back to the colonial moment to be able to think critically about that, about understanding how people see themselves now. Okay, we can go back to even more recent than that, and even trace it previous centuries to there. Okay, so we're trying to maybe disrupt the colonial moment and the 1947 moments as being ones that suddenly shake up these religious categories. Okay, those are categories that have been made and unmade depending on the political times. Okay, I think 1947, the partition, of course, of this year, has been something that have become kind of emphasized for obvious reasons and very important ones, but also have served a purpose of reifying the kind of the religious question, if you like. It makes religion as the kind of the defining category for people in terms of where they see themselves. You know, people may be atheist, but still see themselves as spiritually Punjabi. There are a lot of different interpretations of spirituality and religiosity in Punjab that don't register because they're not institutionally important. And they don't actually also serve state mechanisms of social control as the colonial state needed, and also the national projects needed them as well. Okay, so that the ways, our approach to some of these questions is one to look historically, critically at these categories and to not fall into the trap. I think we're kind of going into the field work thinking kind of very reflexively about why it is we're actually asking these questions and what kind of types of categories might we come up with if they're not the same or maybe completely different ones. We will be spending time obviously in both East and West Punjab at a number of different sites, and the idea is that we look at the state, the state level in terms of how it constructs and the machinery and how it uses in terms of discourses on religion, and there's also in terms of religious organizations, institutions and shrines, what types of messages they give out in terms of the wider sense of spirituality and belonging. They're then also looking in terms of worshippers, you know, how are they using the site, and through this we'll be doing ethnographies of a number of different sites, and branching out then from there, because there are a lot of issues that emerge once we begin to look at the sites, because in fact those sites can cause lots of other problems in terms of defining people, who goes where, and oftentimes there's a lot of kind of covert types of worship or something that people may not even register as being religious as such. You know, between going to in the morning routine, going to the Pir's tomb and doing puja at home, there might be lots of different things that may not be seen as being religious. So we're going to actually be making contacts from those sites and using kind of these diaries of worship in which people will be working with, you know, people that we come across in terms of actually thinking about how it is people are imagining their own kind of spiritual religious life and what types of things they see are registering within that, what things are not. So it's kind of going back and forth between the kind of state level, the religious institutional level, looking in terms of the practices, in terms of actually what people do when they go out, and how they register them. And despite all of that, we see the kind of privileging of the big kind of questions around religion. That's another question we'll kind of be trying to address, is that how, despite the popular and the demotic, that's the big kind of religious markings or categories or notions of what it means to belong, they maintain. So maybe there's kind of developed within Punjab, I don't know, but we may find a kind of safety catch, safety valve that has its historical roots in just managing a very diverse kind of religious socioscape within Punjab, that people just sort of get on in a particular way. And it's about understanding how the state, and there's another dimension that comes in here, it's not just the site, but the Indian and Pakistani states, how they've operated differentially, comparatively, in terms of kind of managing religious minorities, kind of maintaining kind of state control and the use of kind of religious identity, but also in their own different ways trying to kind of appear as though the state has some kind of function within the popular. Religion presents a threat, but it also is important for those vote banks. So they're very kind of complicated types of questions. Once we begin to kind of scratch the surface on this, by looking at the popular, there are a number of different things that I think we'll need to look at. One last thing, I don't know if everyone wants to add anything, but we also, by looking at gender and caste as the lens, and it's going to be built into our kind of frame of method, in terms of our methodology. We're kind of starting off with some vague understanding of formal kind of religious institutions. I'm just going to kind of end with an example. Formal religious institutions as kind of being led largely by men, and perhaps having, in terms of formal religious institutions, meaning Sikh, Hindu, Muslim. But there's a lot that doesn't get registered as the formal, which can be equally, as I mentioned earlier, equally important, if not more important, in terms of kind of the demographics. So when we go back to May earlier this year, actually when we were putting this proposal together, 2007, which was for us, I think, very important. It's kind of highlighted, I think, the importance of this work. And I'll just kind of give you one example here. Okay, and this is the Dera Sacha Soda case that people probably here have heard about. That after 2 days of violence, the followers of Dera Sacha Soda, and obviously clashes that have been happening across the cities of Punjab, which were demanding the apology of what he was called His Holiness Hazur Maharaj Sant Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh Ji. The name is loaded of references to, obviously, as a Muslim, Sikh. What is? How can we locate this person? And interestingly, the press weren't able to actually put their finger on who it was. A sect, it was a cult, and very clearly framed around a Dalit identity as well, which, as I was mentioning earlier, to my own observations in Amritsar, of the kind of what we I may have read at that point as being kind of some religious syncretic practices and mixing. But in fact, here it becomes institutionalized within this dera. The Sant, or Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh, comes out dressed as Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th Sikh Guru. And he eventually does make a public apology. And one of the questions a lot of questions that come out of this case is one that all of Punjab comes to a standstill at this point. There are curfews across Punjab. And the other side of it is, of course, with the change of government in Punjab, that what does this mean for either Dalit politics or identity in terms of the religious? This kind of the blind eye had been maybe seen, as the Akalis would have seen it, turned by the previous Congress government that allowed the Dera to continue its activities. And of course we're looking at Punjab and East Punjab and Indian Punjab, where there's about 27% which would be seen as scheduled caste, which is quite a significant proportion of the population in terms of votes, in terms of political patronage. Okay, so this example, the threat that was being posed, where of course the Akalis would have been very important, but other Sikh organizations and followings would have been important, which people were saying this is very similar to what had happened in the late 1970s with the Nirankaris. And the Akali kind of clash, a similar one at the same time, where you can see politicized religious identity as it's become politicized in this case, but it continued we could see it as being popular. But what was different about it is it had what seemed a very clear kind of Dalit following, okay, which made it something else. It's creating its own institution that says we can't be part of the formal religious identity, whether it be Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, and Dalit religious spiritual practices, whatever you want to call them, when they become institutionalized, become the formal. They become the religious. They become the institution, which becomes a very important threat. So that's just an example I'm highlighting. It's not seen as kind of the example, but showing that this isn't just minor. This isn't just the marginal that we're talking about by saying gender and caste are important. These do raise very important questions for contemporary Punjab, which really doesn't the kind of throwing out the big religious identities of say Hindu, Sikh, Christian, Muslim. This example doesn't really have much meaning when you've got the example of the name that he uses that has all of the terminologies there together. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. That will give us about 25 minutes for
Any feedback? I'm trying to just throw in ideas. I'm really think I'm in on this to clarify.
If I may pick up the discussion by giving two observations. There are many more, but I'll just confine to two. I think it's a fascinating project which you are doing, and also comparing East and West Punjab. And I can see the main overarching sort of aim of the project is to question the side of religion as the main dominant category, and which obviously syndicated by history because of partition and Pakistan, formally based on religion, but India not formally, but the constitution has clear limitations and actual practice is more limitations in terms of its secularism. Two questions which I want to raise is one, you mentioned about Oberoi, and I can see that you want to highlight this fluidity and you want to see the diversity of practices, Peer being worshipped by Sikhs and Hindus and temple being worshipped by Sikhs and Muslims and so on and so forth. And questioning the hegemonic sort of association with one religious practice, Golden Temple with the Sikhs and Manchali with the Hindus and so on and so forth. Now, one problem when I read Oberoi's work, I had, and I just want to highlight, you might want to think it, that Oberoi does this work very well about the diversity of social practices, and that's a very valuable contribution. But where his work is poor is that when he's talking about contesting paradigms in Tat Khalsa and non-Tat Khalsa, he's not able to explain very well why Tat Khalsa became hegemonic. Now the question which arises, is there something in the Tat Khalsa tradition which is able to link in a longer term span to the fundamentals of Sikhism that it becomes hegemonic? So in the light of that criticism, my question would be that you might want to look at this, that Golden Temple, yes, sort of Hindus also go there, and probably Punjabi Muslims also go there, and in Khana Sahib, obviously lots of Muslims go there. But what is it in Golden Temple, which it's in its history and tradition that it is predominantly still a Sikh place? So you need to have both. Merely saying it's kind of fluid and diversity, it doesn't capture the full reality of this. One also needs to explain that. That's one.
You're saying it is still a Sikh.
Yeah, it is. It's predominantly a Sikh place, if one doesn't do that, then it looks kind of too open and too fluid, which doesn't capture the reality of this. While Sikh imagination, or even the imagination of others, it still remains a Sikh place. And similarly, it could be said about Manasa Devi. So that's one. So one need to have this dialectical, the hackneyed word, but it's a very good word. To have this, that why it is hegemonic despite being diverse, and you might want to highlight diversity because that's less highlighted, as you rightly pointed out. That's one. Second, I was thinking about that when you talk about fluidity, about sort of Sikh institutions and Muslims and Hindus, it's absolutely right, and that's a brilliant idea, and you need to explore this. But as a suggestion, I would also think that maybe you also need to think about the unevenness of this fluidity between different traditions. Now it's very interesting that there is a newspaper quotation you sort of showed from, I suppose Desh Pradesh or one of the Punjabi newspapers, that it's mainly Sikh leadership, but the Maulvi's advertisement is being given. And obviously there are some Sikhs who will be actually bringing him up and seeking his blessings and so on and so forth. Now it will be worth examining whether similar kind of institution, whether it's a newspaper or it could be something else, in the Muslim tradition, in the Hindu tradition, say for example, a paper which has readership mainly among the Hindus, would also give an advertisement for a Maulvi. It might give for a Sikh Baba, but would it give for a Muslim Maulvi? Similarly, a newspaper which has primarily Muslim leadership, will it give an advertisement for a Sikh Baba and Hindu leadership? It may. But I'm saying this is a question which needs to be sort of probed and kept in mind that though there is a fluidity, but there may be unevenness in this fluidity. And if it does demonstrate that there is unevenness, then one needs to also look at those traditions. That Sikhism actually might be much more Punjabi religion, which is kind of able to see much more diversity and so that's the kind of second point. I have more, but I can finish and leave it open to others. I don't know whether you want to first respond to question by question or you want
Let's
to
do question by question, otherwise.
No, yeah.
I mean, the second one, the unevenness, I think is I think one of the most difficult ones for us to think through. Was I recently reading something by a JPS Oberoi, and he has a very classic argument, really. And I think in terms of how most people who belong to religious traditions in Punjab would probably view the relationships between Sikh, Muslim and Hindu. Kind of the classic kind of Bhakti argument that looks at the big religions as Hindu and Muslim, and the Sikh kind of comes in between as a sort of modernist kind of voice or movement from within. I mean, there are actually lots of interpretations of how, within literature on what Sikhism actually represents. Whereas others might view Sikhism very much within the Sufi tradition. What functions does that make? That Oberoi, this other older Oberoi's argument very firmly posits Sikhism as this kind of bridge between the two. That it has some kind of relationship with each of these, but it's a very privileged relationship because it's the only religion that is actually can say it's of the place, and so that special relationship enables it to kind of look backward and forward, and yet it is the modernist Punjabi kind of spiritual voice. And I don't think what we're saying is actually, I think it's probably going to counter that position really, is by saying, in fact, I mean, there's so many examples I could probably give just but how and when people become Muslim or Sikh. I mean, how many people have we met in our travels who have last names and will say, yes, we are Sikh actually, but we're Muslims living in Pakistan now. And when did you become Muslim? I'm not sure actually when. In fact, were we Sikhs then? No, we were a particular landowning caste. So even in terms of people's own histories, do they actually know where that lineage comes from or went to? And I don't think it's a matter of remembering or forgetting. It's the fact that religion wasn't being spoken of or even internalized or understood in the same terms. I think there's a lot of messiness rather than fluidity. And the fluidity means that we're just kind of trying to chart and I think the messiness also shows that there are bottlenecks there. And I think in terms of how different people view how Sikhism fits in, how people view how Dalits fit in within power structures, really informs where that messiness happens. Who can belong and who can't? Who's allowed to come into the Golden Temple and who's allowed to sit on the management committee of the SGPC? And there are very different senses of belonging to that category, depending on who you are and where you are. I mean, those types of questions need to be asked. I mean, I think the Golden Temple is very symbolic and emblematic of Sikh identity, but yet it also means, why is the meaning of newly married couples or whatever background or Dalit, they might be Bihari migrants going, which is a very common sight there in the Golden Temple, that if you begin to look at actually how is this space being used, how is this sacred space being used, what are people doing, why are they coming to this? Not because they're trying to say this is my stamp of Sikh identity. They're doing a lot of different things. So I think what we're trying to do is not say that these places are, or actually we'll probably do that tracing. Why did the Golden Temple become so important? Of course, it was important before 1947 as well. It also becomes important in terms of Sikh history and how it's taught, and it gets used in terms of even not only Sikh history but even an anti-Muslim perhaps history, which undermines that fluidity argument about Punjab being diverse. It kind of disrupts the idea that you could be Muslim and Sikh at the same time. And how is it, how is it that many people actually feel comfortable saying it? They may not say it in public places, but we might actually say it. I mean, the number of people I've heard say that we are this. We may not be practicing that. We're Muslim, but we identify somehow with Sikhism. And the same goes across for the Hindu-Sikh kind of relationship. But I mean, I think each of those categories have their own history, and I think it just depends on who you are, where you are. I think I'm not saying it's completely relational, but I think the caste dimension comes in there very, very strongly.
I was going to say that to answer both of your questions, if we are trying to reframe those questions in terms of gender and caste. So, fluidity and fixity in Golden Temple, what we're saying is that, yeah, there's both fluidity and fixity, but it actually revolves around gender and caste. So yes, if you're a man on the SPGC, you have more investment in that being Sikh, because that gives, there's much more for you as part of that formal Amritari Khalsa identity. Whereas if you're a Dalit woman who's then it's fluid, that space for you, right? So we're saying that there's a gender and caste matrix, and so then if you want to talk about hegemonic, Islam, Hinduism, then the quick answer to that is to say, well, Islam would be hegemonic, let's say in Punjab historically. But actually, no. When you look at caste and gender, Jats are hegemonic in Punjab. So yeah, when I go to Pakistan, if I meet, people come up to you and say, oh, actually we are Sikhs, and actually what they're saying is we're Jats. Yeah. So people do this all the time when we go to Pakistan. People come up to me all the time and say, I'm a Sikh actually, and I go, what? And actually what they're saying is, I'm a Vedic or I'm a Sandhu or I'm a, but they will say that. They won't say that. They'll say we are Sikh. But just someone we met recently, they call their eldest sister. What's her name? Her name is Famida or something, and they call her Faminda because they kind of they're playing on their Sandhus. So I think that when you look at caste and gender, what we're trying to do is caste and gender to disrupt the whole idea of, well, not disrupt the whole idea of religion, but to say actually, this supports, the caste gender matrix supports some kind of formal religious identity, and it kind of disrupts other kinds of, not to say that no, there isn't fixity or fluidity, or there isn't continuities of tradition, because clearly you have continuities of tradition, but when you look at it from this way, actually all sorts of funny things start happening. That you can't immediately just say, oh, the religion is hegemonic in this place. No, religion becomes hegemonic in this place. A certain type of religion becomes hegemonic.
And certain things become sacrilegious, like the Deras Sajjasana
because
that becomes, I think the Deras are a very important dimension to religious kind of practice in Punjab as well.
And the
Swamis,
even the Deras Sajjasana is actually an example of Sikh hegemony, right? They're using Sajjasana. Ram Rahim comes in Sukhmani Sahib. It's actually lifted directly from, but what they're doing with it is all slightly messy and confusing. And I suppose that's what we're trying to do is grasp a bit of that. But it's complicated.
Can I just ask for clarification?
Rakesh, Elmer, yeah, okay.
It's clarification. Is your research based on geographical Punjab, or are you looking at situation as it's been transported into the UK?
It's in Punjab.
So you're not looking at all at how it might have been transported.
We will eventually, but I think we actually need to do this work in Punjab before we would feel comfortable really by talking. I mean, a lot of the newspaper adverts that I have here. I've got DDG, I've got Professor Baba, I've got they're constant. They're everywhere. The shade, this one, it's just
Second
all
quick
over
one:
the place.
are you conducting it in Punjabi? What language?
It will be in Punjabi. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, we're assuming that Punjabi will be the language spoken, but probably if we need to use any Urdu or Hindi, we could probably manage that too.
Do you have some question?
No, I was more interested in how the situation there, the fluidity and diversity, has been transported to this country. I mean, if we had more time over lunch, I'd tell you about our family, how it fits into that.
No, for the language thing.
The language thing, I was worried because a lot of researchers go there and do it in English.
Right.
Use of interpreters and so on. And you don't.
Now we've actually, that's the reason we've done this project. We're doing the research ourselves. We could probably get people to do that.
Sure.
Both of us have done field research in Punjab and in Punjabi, so we're quite comfortable with it.
Thanks.
But there will be a lot, I think, that will come out in terms of the British context. And with Eleanor's work, probably hook up with this in terms of. Do you begin to look at religious institutions then in Britain, how they come up? in terms of exclusion, inclusion, actually going and how different new institutions get created out of that framing. So I'm sure we'll eventually get to the diaspora.
Yeah, obviously I'm fascinated in what you're doing, and I can think of all sorts of incidents in Punjab when I've been there that fit into what you're referring to. I'm wondering how useful and how foregrounded Roger's sort of matrix of calm, tone, punth will be, and whether you'll actually find the cosmetic dimension as being extremely significant, because whatever you say you are the rest of the time, if somebody's desperately ill and you're trying to ease the situation, you will go from hospital to hospital and Pandit and Mullah to whoever. And the other question would relate to other media, not just the print media. And I'm thinking, for example, of a case that's very close to home. Okay, there's a Hindu astrologer in Punjab, and a family who are particularly grateful to him at the moment are a Pakistani Muslim family. And one of the things which I suspect has influenced at least one of the family to take seriously his prescriptions is the fact that on television there are astrology programs, you know, that are being watched, and you know, this feeling almost, I wish I had an astrologer like this. So I think it's so there's a question about Roger's framework. I know it goes back to Jürgen's Meyer in a way, but and also how other media are involved.
Oh, I have to talk about Roger's framework. No, I think it's really important. The only thing is, I think the only thing is that we foreground gender and caste much more. In some senses, Roger's framework foregrounds politics much more. It privileges the notion, kind of an idea of going from Gorm as somehow the domain of the political to cosmetic as being the domain of you know, the material. I mean, and of course they're not distinctive. So no, but I think it's really important, and no, it's been really important to the way we're thinking about it. It's just that, yeah, but there are some distinctions about that. I mean, especially when you look at something like Dera Sacha Sodha, or you look at stuff you know, like the Valmiki or the Ravidasi institutionalization in Punjab and Britain. What you find is that actually the cosmetic quickly becomes comic or panthic the second it becomes institutionalized. You know, so Dera Sacha Sodha was also about Congress vote bank versus Akalis in power. So you know, and I think that's where we might be. You know, we would even see. You know, even the small. You know, even the tiniest sort of shrine, if you like, or the cosmetic can always enter into the domain. The slippage between the domains, the four domains, I suppose, is the only difference. And of course, we find much more foreground gender and caste, which is kind of, gender is almost totally absent for Roger, but we would be much more foregrounding gender and caste.
But there is, just to on this point, I mean, I think your work would combine the gender and cosmetic very much. The cosmetic is much more powerful than the gender dimension. Men are not that much, but women, enormous much more.
But then you're seeing gender as women, so we're seeing gender as men and women. So cosmetic is women, fine, but then you have to look at panthic for being men. Yeah. And so that's how the gender
both
work.
Yeah,
actually, if you're going to do gender, then it has to be both. The women do cosmetic maybe, but the men are also doing. But men also do cosmetic. Actually, this is partly.
But it's uneven.
But it's uneven. Yeah, it's uneven. Men also do cosmetic. It's not. I don't think it's that.
I think there was about astrology.
About the media. Yeah. Oh, I mean, yes, of course.
Softening up by Bollywood.
Yes. I mean, I think digital television, satellite television, has certainly opened that up. In fact, the print media is probably less engaging. The print media really opened up. The print media is definitely targeting a market. That, I mean, I remember someone coming all the way from India to come visit. In fact, came to go to Cheshire I'm not sure what, I can't remember who's in Cheshire, but there's a pier out there, yeah, which is very nearby here. A Hindu woman coming to, and her family have been going to this guy either through telephone or writing letters, and there's the kind of different types of communication that people, but I think the digital kind of phone-in kind of format, I'm sure there must be other types of things going on that are much more kind of accessible as well, which will probably strengthen, in fact, that type of activity as well. But there is a definite kind of consumption around these types of activities, whether it be having your hands read or the astrology or getting into the world for whatever. Yeah. But I mean, I think the gender dimension becomes important in terms of how we actually think about who does what as well. This is furthering that question, I think, just which is that women kind of do cultural activities which can bridge on superstition, or which is kind of women's domain, and then the kind of real religion, which will mean sitting on the committees and making sure that the temples operate, managing the finances of those institutions tends to be done by men. And there is a separation in some ways, but there also isn't. It's very important to see how and why it operates in that way. So who's invested in that religious institution? It may be the wife of a management committee member who actually goes to the beach. And, you know, what does that actually mean? She's more likely to do it and not have problems with being seen doing it. Or may do.
Shinda?
Sure, I think
Okay, sorry, I didn't see you. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm sorry.
Shalini.
Yeah, I came in a bit, obviously, quite late, so I missed most of the presentation. And I want to ask a slightly, maybe a question that's not that relevant to you. But what I'm sort of interested in is this notion of Punjabi spirituality. I don't know, I find it slightly, vague, basically. And what I was wondering was, when you were putting together this research proposal, did you sort of look at other cultural contexts? I mean, not just cultural, but say, what's going on in Bengal, what's going on in Kerala, and did you perhaps notice the same sort of diversity or similar sorts of patterns there, syncretic traditions, that sort of thing, or what's so specific about Punjab, and can you, or doesn't this happen in other regions as well? And if it does, what does that mean? And also, I'm sort of saying this because I come from in my work, I'm constantly trying to displace or decenter religion because, I just think that it dominates so much of history writing on Punjab, and I think it's really good that you're looking at it with a lens of, through the lens of gender and caste, at least. But say something like the Dera, that you were talking about. Maybe I'm totally old-fashioned, but I would see this as perhaps, some Dalits having more economic power, and that sort of perhaps fluidity playing out culturally, perhaps in Punjab, or maybe not, and other, say, religious movements as being part of a rising elite, or or at least a group that is acquiring more power, economic power. I was just sort of wondering what you would say to that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if it's sort of vague, but I did.
No,
Yeah,
good question.
that's fine. I think we're doing anything. In fact, in the very beginning, I started off by saying we have problems with the way in which religion is posited at the forefront. So our whole thing actually is trying to look at it from another lens, but actually look at it from the perspective of marginality as being really the important question in terms of understanding what people actually do with either belief or... And in fact, spirituality in the Punjabi context for us is very specific to the context I mean, you could look at it in terms of, say, like Jackie Asai's work, looking at the specificities of kind of Hindu-Muslim kind of interactions, as she would look at, as being something that created something rather different in South India than happened in North India because of trade. So that marked a very different sense of religious belonging, if you like, where there is, or even say, Shel Myron's work of the Mayos in a princely state of Mewat. You know, that's another good example, I think, where I'm not actually comfortable to say, yes, well, that's going on there and that's going on there. But I do know that it's important, I think, to understand the context, to be able to actually speak about it. I think that's why we feel more comfortable speaking about Punjab. But I mean, I'm aware of other examples of where there are different types of maybe ruptures, different forms of how religiosity is just actually done or practiced or is organized. And I think we're trying to look at it we're trying to have an open eye to just kind of trying to get a sense of what's going on here, which goes away from what seems to be happening. I think in the Punjab context, there are kind of marking moments that people tend to fixate on. I could have said, I think, colonial impacts on the region in terms of religious categories, and then 1947 kind of make the religious question something that's, yes, you are this, this, and this, and then that frames how everyone gets on or doesn't get on. But what we're trying to say is actually with the 27%, or I think it's even higher, scheduled caste population in Punjab, the numbers are very, very important.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's a wealthy community.
No, I know.
It's numerically very important.
But it's been politically active before as well.
Yeah, very much so.
Mughal
Yeah.
the Valmikis
Yeah.
in the 30s.
I wanted to just add about Punjabi exceptionalism. Farina Mir has done a fantastic article, which we kind of copied, reduced hugely on Hugh Nanja. And she talks about Hugh Nanja in terms of a Punjabi piety and a specific type of Punjabi piety. And that kind of, to me, is the other exceptions, of course, of partition, two states and two religious. But I think in terms of the way you were asking the question, like what's different maybe from other parts of India, those texts are pretty different from other parts of India. Like, I mean, Hugh Nanja specifically.
What about Bengal?
In terms of Muslim writers, I've not come across similar Sufi texts as such. And so Hugh Nanja is, and like I said, I really recommend it. It's only come out recently, and she does sort of provide quite a convincing argument about Hugh Nanja as the text of a certain kind of piety. And it's a very new take on Hugh Nanja in that way, because it's quite different from what Jeevan's done, Jeevan Dul's done with those kind of texts. She really kind of tries to look at it outside of syncretism, outside of these kind of ways of thinking about it. And there is and I think that history of kind of Sufi writing, or the way in which it's produced, that from Sheikh Baba Farid on to Muhammad Baksh, I think that is quite a kind of sense. There is a certain exceptionalism in that. And Hugh Nanja as the kind of pivotal text, which is framed, it starts off with Allah, but goes off into this incredibly, syncretic text about Krishna and all this kind of stuff.
To what extent, you were talking about the kind of Sikhs being a gateway between the kind of Muslims and the Hindus, and to what extent, whether in Punjab that's a kind of exception, where you've actually got three communities that are working there, as opposed to sort of, the Hindus being dominant or the Muslims being dominant in any particular state, and whereas in Punjab you do have this third group, which, to some extent does sort of bridge those differences between them. So I don't know whether that kind of gives it a different dimension.
But the three things, if one want to bring in Kerala, you mentioned about Kerala, there are the three, where Christians are very important. So, but I think the Punjabi exceptionalism, the fact that Guru Granth Sahib as a text is plural, it will be very difficult to find another example in other religious traditions of similar plurality, where, Baba Farid, is there, where the Bhagats are there, from different traditions. That adds something to the sort of Punjabi diversity or Punjabi exceptionalism. It's very, very, the new faith which is coming itself is kind of more plural and it's very structured.
But I think the Hiranja thing is quite important because Vaishya starts off with Avalo Allah, but then it's written again in the 1850s. I mean, this is what Farina talks about, where a Hindu writer will start it off with Om, and then write Hiranja in their own style. And then some Sikh writers start off with Ikuka, Panchmori, and they put Bart in. So I think there is a textual tradition which may be a bit different from other parts of that I know in the rest of India.
Something that's shared.
Shared textual tradition, which of course is not, it's an oral tradition really, but it has been written. So, and that's kind of interesting because of the whole idea of people being on the book and all this kind of stuff in terms of religious identity. But it's we're going to be exploring.
You want to?
Yeah. Sorry about being late. It's just difficult to get around Manchester if you come, especially if you enter it the wrong way. You never entered it that way before. I've got a number of questions. Some of them you may have dealt with. I think maybe you could have a discussion. The question, I think, the major problem now still. Problem that Freedom started with is the actual conceptualization of the whole issue, gender, identities, etc., etc. I mean, to start with either the Ballard model or Oberoi model, I think is problematic. I don't really think. I think why not start with the view that actually, if you look at 17th, 18th century literature, religious identities are firm. They're developed. These major communities have their book, they have their language, they have a very strong sense of territory. These identities are not fluid at all. They're extremely well established. And of course, the Sikhs will fall into that. But to start with the late 19th century, and to start looking at literature, which is, if you read Oberoi's chapter on the Enchanted Universe, it's literature which is European literature, it's folk tales basically that are told to white people who went there, by presumably indigenous people. And to start with that kind of, just starting with Oberoi makes me a bit nervous.
We didn't say we were starting with Oberoi.
No, but that's where I came in.
Okay,
when you talk about fluidity and fluid identities, etc. And the idea that people are going in and out of religion.
You can start with Yanni Gurdit Singh's book from 1965 called Merapin, right? Which is written, you can quote from. We could give you a quote from a Gurmukhi book written in 1950s by Gurdit Singh, and his chapter on his village. Well, how does it start? What's the start of this village? In my village, every place is a religious. Every corner and every part, every tree, every well, every rock and stone is a source of spirituality for the people of my village.
That's the point I wanted to make.
And then he ends by saying, the Gurdwara is the most important for me.
Spirituality is a different thing.
That's the question. That's our question. Was spirituality religion? It's not.
But it seems to me it's not clear when you start introducing identities into it. That's what complicates it. If, for example, you talk about hegemony. To me, I don't know whether anybody's done any work, but I would say the largest following among the Sikh community are not Jats. Right? But if you ask me a question about the caste composition of the followers of Sikhism, I could not answer it. But it certainly won't be Jats, right? But if you ask me a question about political power, who holds political power, that would be a different kind of answer. But we're not are we interested in spirituality? Are we interested in, for example, are we interested in shared aspects of popular religion, institutionalized religion? Why shouldn't they overlap? We need to ask the question of where and when do they overlap? Just because a Sikh goes to Mansa Devi, goes to Nainan Devi, does not make him any less a Sikh. We need to look at the rites of passage of these people. Do they, is the death ceremony Muslim in one case, or Sikh in another, or Christian in another? What are these? We don't look at these identities. And by putting everything together, it's confusing the picture. I can't conceptualize it. That's the problem I have at the moment.
Sarjeet, you want to ask?
Oh, I wanted to ask, firstly, like, what was the name of the person who wrote He That the woman?
Oh, the guy who wrote. Oh no, the article is Farina Mead, M-I-R.
What was the first name?
Farina.
Farina.
A-R-I-N-A.
Wilder's student, isn't it?
Yeah.
She's at Michigan.
The second name?
Mead, M-I-R.
Can I just last question for you? You mentioned Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and I think, I don't know whether your project includes, there is some kind of need to also probe and interact with Christianity. Because the Christianity, I mean, that links up in some sense with Shinda's question. Because the coming of Christianity, not only you're acting like in the fourth religion in Punjab, they are more than 1% part of the latest census, and even in 1991 they were more than 1%, just slightly less than Muslims in eastern Punjab. But if one is now looking at the sort of partition and colonialism, it's the entry of colonialism and Christianity as a project of colonialism, which actually leads to solidification of religious identities. So Christianity is implicated in, I mean, a number it may not be, but it's very much implicated in the whole project of solidification of identities. And also, it will be also recognition of the material reality of I don't know whether the project includes, but it might be worth. And then the sort of intermixing of Christianity with Dalit identity, especially in the Doaba belt, is another dimension. But
I think it's important, very important. And it serves different purposes as well in both East and West Punjab as well. It's also, I think, the reason. Actually, we do mention it in our kind of the framing.
Because in West Punjab, your scheduled castes are Christians. There's like 10 million Christians in West Punjab. It's a huge, it's a massive minority.
2%, I think, and the number in 55 million is very good.
Yeah, it's a big number of Christians.
But also, like,
That'll be the last.
I think, like, prior to Sikhism, you had like Hindu, Muslim, Buddhism, and Christianity. But then I think along with Sikhism came. I mean, I was brought up as a Sikh, but I wouldn't label myself as a Sikh because I don't think that's important for me anyway. But because I think that every kind of, for me, Guru Nanak was a questioner, and you question things around him. And I think with Guru Nanak and his philosophy came questioning of things around you, and I think that brought